The fire was still burning when Nathan Alderman arrived. He came up the Holt Farm path on the morning of October 15th, 1884, carrying the fencing maul he had borrowed from Abel Holt 3 weeks before and had been meaning to return. The morning was clear and cold, the specific hard cold of an October morning on the ridge after the first real frost, the ground frozen at its surface and the air still carrying the smell of it. He came up the path at a little past 8 and saw the smoke from the chimney before he saw the house, the steady, generous smoke of a fire that was burning well. He came through the gate. The farm was quiet in the ordinary way of a farm in the early morning, the animals in the barn, the yard empty, the house still. He crossed the yard and knocked at the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Called, Abel, called, Miriam. No answer from inside. He tried the latch. The door swung inward easily, the way it swung when it was unlatched, not locked, not stuck, simply pulled to without being secured. He stood in the doorway. The fire was burning. Not the low remnant burn of a fire that had been banked for the night. The active, well-fed burn of a fire with fresh wood on it. The specific, bright burn of new fuel fully caught. The sound of it was the sound of a good fire doing what a good fire did. Someone had added wood to this fire recently. He stood in the doorway and read the burn the way you read any fire, and what it told him was, within the last hour. An hour was his best estimate. Less, possibly. That was the first thing that was wrong. Someone had been here. Recently. And no one had answered the door. He stepped inside. The table was set for breakfast. The bread had been cut. 4 slices on the board beside the knife still resting where it had been set down mid-task, the specific placement of a utensil not put away but paused. A pot of coffee sat on the trivet at the fire's edge. He crossed to the pot and held his hand over it. Warm, not hot, the warmth of coffee that had been made and had been sitting. An hour, perhaps. He pressed his palm lightly to the pot's side. Still warm. He looked at the table. 4 cups. One of them had been poured. The coffee in it had gone cold, the surface of it showing the specific flat, cold surface of a drink that had been poured and left for longer than an hour. 4 cups on the table. 1 poured, 3 empty. The room did not look abandoned. It looked interrupted. He stood in the Holt kitchen and held what he was looking at in his mind. The burning fire, the warm pot, the cut bread, the 1 cold cup, and understood that these things together were telling him that the Holt family had been in this room within the last hour, and that they were not in this room now, and that those 2 facts needed to be reconciled. He went to find them. He expected to. If you find yourself drawn to places like this, quiet and not quite empty, consider subscribing. There are more like this waiting. The Holt farm had been on the south end of the hollow since Abel's father put the first structure up in 1847. Abel himself had been born on the property and had farmed it his whole life. A man of 51 in October or 1884, solid and specific in his habits, the way a man became who had worked the same ground for 30 years, without interruption. Nathan had known Abel Holt since boyhood. He knew the sound of his voice and the width of his boot, and the way he moved through the hollow, unhurried, deliberate, the specific pace of a man who knew every step of the ground he was covering. He knew Miriam Holt since she came to the hollow as a young wife in 1858, and had become over 26 years one of the hollow's essential people, the kind of person whose presence you noticed not because they sought attention, but because they were reliable in the way a landmark was reliable. Clara and Jonas he had watched grow up. Jonas had helped him with his fence line last spring. 4 people on one farm. A full household by the Hollow's measure, and a household Nathan knew well. He stood in their empty yard and understood that what he was looking at was not a thing that had a simple explanation. He should have heard something. A voice from the barn, a step on the path, anything. A farm with 4 people on it at 8 in the morning made sound. He stood in the yard and heard nothing from it, except the fire through the open door. Nathan went to the barn first, because the barn was where Abel was most likely to be at this hour. The morning feeding, the milking, the first round of farm work that began before or just after sunrise on any working day. He pulled back the barn door. The animals were there. The 2 horses at their stalls, the milk cow, the hens in their section. He looked at them the way you looked at farm animals when you were trying to determine how long they had been waiting. The specific behavior of animals that had been expecting their morning routine and had not received it. The feed bin was latched. The hay in the horses' section was yesterday's hay, picked over and insufficient. The cow shifted when he came in, the specific movement of an animal that needed milking and had been waiting longer than she should have been waiting. The animals had not been fed, had not been tended. Whatever the morning's routine included for this barn, it had not happened yet. He looked at the unfed animals and thought about Abel Holt's tracks to the barn twice that morning. Abel had been in this barn that morning, had been here and done something and left, and the animals had been waiting since. The cow turned her head toward him. He latched the barn back and stood in the yard. He called out, "Abel, Miriam." His voice carried in the cold morning air and returned nothing. He walked to the well. The well rope was dry. Whoever had drawn water that morning had drawn it long enough ago that the rope had dried in the cold air. He looked at the ground around the well. The soft October earth held marks clearly. Boot prints, the specific pattern of someone standing at the well and drawing water. The marks fresh enough that they showed the ridges of Abel's work boot sole, which Nathan recognized from years of seeing those boots in the mud of the Hollow's paths. Fresh tracks. Abel had been at this well this morning. Nathan looked at the tracks and then looked at the farm around him, the house with its burning fire, the barn with its unfed animals, the yard with its empty quiet, and felt the first specific quality of wrongness settle into the morning. He went back inside and looked at the house more carefully. The main room held the kitchen and the eating table and the 2 chairs that Abel and Miriam used for their evenings. Both chairs were in their places, slightly angled toward the fire, the way they were always positioned. Nothing knocked over, nothing displaced, nothing that suggested any event had occurred in this room other than the ordinary morning routine of a household beginning its day. He went to the sleeping room. Both beds had been slept in. The sheets were disturbed, the pillows bearing the compressed impression of heads that had rested there through the night. The specific dishevelment of beds that had been left in the morning, not made, not tidied, the way you left them when you intended to get back to that. Not the dishevelment of beds that had been left in a hurry or in fear. The dishevelment of an ordinary morning. A nightgown lay across the foot of Miriam's side of the bed, laid there, not dropped, the specific deliberate placement of something set aside to be dealt with later in the day. Abel's work trousers were on the hook by the door. He had not left in his work trousers. He had left in his other pair, which Nathan could not account for in the room. He checked the children's room. Clara's bed was slept in and left unmade in the same ordinary way. Her hairbrush was on the small table beside the bed, her outdoor coat on the hook by the door. If she had gone outside for any extended period, she would have taken the coat. The coat was there. Jonas's bed was the same, a book on his bedside table, open to the page he had been reading, placed face down the way you placed a book when you intended to return to it within the hour. Not closed and set aside, placed down temporarily as a pause between one thing and the next. Nathan stood in Jonas's room and looked at the open book on the table. Everything in this house said, "We were here. We were in the middle of our mourning. We will be back." Nothing in it said where they had gone. He went outside again, and this time he read the ground carefully. Nathan Alderman had been reading ground his whole life, the specific skill of a man who had farmed and hunted and trapped in country where the ground told you things you needed to know. He moved slowly through the yard in the way he had learned to move, not looking for a specific track, but reading the whole surface first, building the general picture before focusing on any particular element of it. The yard of the Holt farm, on the morning of October 15th, 1884, contained a great deal of evidence of ordinary morning activity. The barn, multiple sets of tracks to and from the barn door, the specific boot-heavy pattern of someone who had been in and out several times. He identified Abel's work boots by their width and the pattern of the sole. He had been seeing those boots in the mud of the hollow for 20 years and knew them. Abel had been to the barn at least twice that morning. The well, the tracks he had already seen, Abel's prints, and beside them another set, Jonas's narrower, the print of a younger man's boot. Both of them had been at the well. The water bucket had been drawn. The woodpile, tracks to and from the woodpile stack at the north end of the house. Fresh-cut chips on the ground below the splitting block, still pale, not yet rained on. Someone had split wood this morning. These were the tracks of a household doing what a household did in the first hour of daylight: feeding animals, drawing water, managing fuel for the fire. 4 people's tracks, in the specific patterns of morning farm work, distributed through the yard in the ordinary way. Nathan walked each set to its source and its end. Abel's tracks. Barn, woodpile, the path between the house and the barn again. All within the property. The last track he could find from Abel's boots was in front of the woodpile, pointing back toward the house. The last place Abel had been standing that Nathan could determine was between the woodpile and the house door, facing the door. Miriam's tracks. The garden plot on the south side of the house. The kitchen door. The well once. The soft earth of the garden path held her print clearly. The last track he could find from Miriam's print was at the kitchen door, the impression deep and fresh, pointing inside. Clara's tracks. The path from the house to the barn and back. Once. The barn door. The house door. Her last track was inside the yard, between the barn and the house, the impression clear and recent. Jonas's tracks. The well, the woodpile, the house. His last track was at the house's east corner, pointing toward the road. Nathan stood at the east corner and looked toward the road. The road was 20 yards away, across a section of soft October earth. Plowed ground from the fall turning, the specific dark earth that held every impression with the fidelity of fresh wax. He looked at that earth carefully. No track crossed it. He walked the south fence line to the road. Clear. He walked the east fence. Clear. He walked the north fence to the timber line. 30 yards of open ground, every footfall visible. No track entered the timber. He walked to the creek on the west side. The bank was the soft mud of a creek bank after recent rain, the surface as clear as a clean page. Nothing. He stood at the creek bank and looked back at the farm. The Holt family had been in this yard this morning. He had their tracks, 4 sets in the patterns of the morning's work, laid down in the hour before he arrived. Every track he could find began and ended within the farm's boundaries. Not one of them led anywhere outside it. He stood at the creek bank for a long time. He had been reading ground for 30 years. He knew when he had missed something, and he knew when there was nothing to miss. He had not missed anything. There was simply nothing to find past the farm's edges, and the family was not within the farm's edges, and those two facts were not compatible with any account he had. He went to get help. He found Thomas Cord at his own farm a mile up the ridge road. Thomas listened to him without interrupting, and then said, "Let me get my coat." They stopped at Will Pratt's place on the way back, and Will came without question, the way the Hollows people came to things that needed doing. The 3 of them arrived at the Holt farm in the early afternoon. Nathan stood at the center of the yard and explained what he had found and what he had looked for and where he had looked, as specifically as he could, so that Thomas and Will would understand what the search still needed, rather than covering ground Nathan had already covered. Thomas took the north and east timber, 400 yards in each direction, moving through it with the slow, overlapping method that serious searching required. Will took the creek bottom and the south fields, the soft ground that would hold any track clearly. Nathan went back to the yard and the house, more slowly this time, looking not for what he had looked for the first time, but for what he might have overlooked. He found what he had found the first time. Thomas came back from the timber in the late afternoon. He came into the yard and stood with Nathan, and his face said what his words confirmed. Nothing. No tracks entering the timber from the farm side. No disturbance in the leaf cover. No broken branch. No dropped anything. No sign of any person having moved through the north or east woods in any recent period. Will came back from the creek. Nothing. The soft mud of the creek bank undisturbed. The south fields, plowed October ground, dark and clear, the kind of ground that held a footfall like a mold. No track past the farm's fence line in any direction. They stood in the Holt yard in the afternoon light. Thomas said, 4 people. 4, Nathan said, and nothing leaving. Nothing. Will had been looking at the house. The fire's still going. They all looked at the chimney. The smoke was thinner now, the fire lower, the fresh wood consumed, moving toward coals, but still burning, still producing the specific presence of a fire that had been tended and had not yet reached the end of what it had been given. "Someone put wood on that fire this morning," Will said. "Yes." And then they were gone. Nathan looked at the chimney for a moment. "And then they were gone," he said. He thought about what it meant that the fire was still going. It was not a comfort. It was, if anything, the most unsettling single element of the morning, more unsettling than the empty house and the unmade beds and the tracks that went nowhere, because the fire was evidence of presence. Someone had been here this morning, and had tended that fire with the specific attentiveness of someone who was going to need it. Someone had made a decision about the fire, had looked at it and added wood and thought, "That will do," and then had been gone. The fire was still going. There was no one left to tend it. They searched the farm a second time as the light failed, moving through it with lamps, looking at the ground and the outbuildings and the house more slowly than the first pass had allowed. Nathan found two things on this second pass that he had not found on the first, or had found and had not yet understood the significance of. The first was the water bucket. It was beside the well, full to the brim, drawn and set down, the water cold and undisturbed, a skim of ice just beginning at the surface from the afternoon cold. Abel had drawn the water and set the bucket down beside the well, and had not taken it anywhere. He had walked to the well, drawn water, set down the result of his effort, and had not completed the action. The bucket was a half-finished task, the first half done, the second half not begun. Nathan crouched beside it and looked at the full bucket in the lamplight. He thought about Abel drawing that water. It was a specific action. You went to the well with a purpose. You drew the water. You took the water somewhere. Abel had drawn it. He had not taken it anywhere. The second thing was in the kitchen, on the windowsill above the table. A slip of paper in Miriam's handwriting, the specific, careful handwriting of a woman who wrote economically and precisely, each word placed as though space were a consideration. A measurement, a number and a unit, a figure Nathan could not immediately place in any context. Not a shopping note, not an address. A measurement of something, written down in the specific way of a person who needed to remember a number and wrote it down rather than trust their memory. Miriam had written this note and put it on the sill and had not returned to whatever it referred to. He stood at the windowsill with the paper in his hand and thought about Miriam writing it. The act of writing it, the intent behind it, the specific future she had assumed when she wrote it down and put it where she would see it later. She had expected to see it later. She had written the note because she would need the number, and she had put it on the sill because that was where you put things you needed to come back to. She had not come back. These two things together, the bucket full and waiting, the note waiting to be returned to, were, Nathan thought, the truest evidence of what had happened. Not the absence of tracks, not the burning fire, but these two small, incomplete things. The work half done, the task deferred. The Holts had been in the middle of their mourning, and the mourning had simply stopped for them, not the way a departure stopped a mourning, but the way a sentence stopped when someone set down their pen in the middle of a word. The farm continued because the farm was a physical thing, and physical things continued. The bucket held the water Abel had drawn. The note held the number Miriam had written. The fire continued to burn on the wood that had been added to it, and the Holts were not there to complete any of it. He wrote in his notebook that night. He had been keeping this notebook for 20 years. Events in the hollow that were unusual, observations he made about the land and its people, and the specific things that happened here that he had learned over 2 decades tended to happen in a place with this history. He had written a great many things in it. He had never written anything quite like what he wrote that night. The Holt family, Abel, Miriam, Clara, Jonas, are absent from their farm as of the morning of October 15th, 1884. The farm shows evidence of occupation through approximately 7 to 8 a.m. on that date. No evidence of departure. No tracks past the farm's boundary lines. No sign of disturbance or struggle. The fire was burning at 8 a.m. and was well tended. The breakfast was in preparation. The beds were left unmade in the way of a morning in which making them would be attended to later. The water bucket was full beside the well. A note in Miriam Holt's hand was on the kitchen windowsill. He paused. I have done what I can do. I searched the farm and its surroundings with Thomas Cord and Will Pratt, who are reliable. We found no evidence of where the family went. I have no account for their absence. He paused again. The phrase that keeps coming to me is that they are missing. But missing implies that they went somewhere, and we have not found where. The evidence does not support that they went anywhere. The evidence supports that they were here, doing what they did on any ordinary October morning, and then they were not here. The transition between those two states left no trace that 3 experienced men could find in a full day of looking. He looked at what he had written. I do not have a word for what that is. Missing is not the right word. Gone is closer, but gone implies a direction, a destination, a somewhere that the gone to went to. This is not that. They were here, and then they were not here, and there is no account of the space between those two things. He set the notebook down and sat in his house in the October dark and thought about Abel Holt's boot prints in the mud by the well, pointing back toward the house, the last place Nathan could determine that Abel had been standing. The hollow looked for the Holt family for 2 weeks. Not continuously. There was farm work that could not be set aside, but persistently, in the way the hollow looked for things it had lost. Nathan organized it. The south drainage, the north timber, the east ridge trail, the low country west of the creek in sections, pairs of people covering each one and reporting back before dark. Each day they reported. Nothing. After 5 days, Nathan widened the search, brought in people from the next hollow over, covered ground he had not thought they could have reached, sent pairs back over sections already searched on the theory that fresh eyes caught things, tired ones missed. The second pass produced the same result. At the end of 2 weeks, he wrote in his notebook, "The search is complete, to the extent a search of this terrain can be complete. We have not found the Holt family or any evidence of where they went. I am satisfied that if they went anywhere within reasonable reach of this property, we would have found something. We have found nothing." He wrote, "The Hollow has done this work without complaint and with full attention. People gave time they did not have. The Holts were known here. The not knowing is its own weight." He wrote, "Abel Holt's neighbor on the south side has been feeding the farm animals since October 15th. The animals are in good condition. The farm is otherwise as it was." He wrote, "The fire burned until mid-afternoon on October 15th, and then went out naturally. It had not been tended after approximately 7 to 8 a.m. It burned for 6 to 7 hours on its last feeding, and then became coals, and the coals cooled, and the hearth went cold." He set down his pen. He wrote one more line. There was no one left to tend it. No explanation came. The Holts had been in the Hollow for 37 years, Abel's whole life, Miriam's adult life, Clara's and Jonas's entire lives. They had the specific rootedness of a family that had been in a place long enough that the place was partially made from them. The roads worn slightly in the directions they regularly walked, the fields carrying the decisions they had made about what to grow and where, the hollow's social fabric including them so naturally that their absence registered not as a whole, but as a wrongness, the specific wrongness of a familiar thing removed. The hollow missed them in the practical way first. The farm needed someone. The animals needed tending. The specific gaps that 4 working people left in a community that had counted on them. And then, in the other way, which was less practical and more persistent, the way of people who had been here, reliably, for nearly 40 years and were now not here, and had left no account of why. The farm went to Abel's brother in the valley, who came up into November and walked through the house and the barn and the yard and came to Nathan at the end of it and said, "There's nothing to tell me what happened." "No," Nathan said. They were standing in the yard. The air was cold, November's specific cold, the farm lying quiet around them. "The fire," Abel's brother said. "You said the fire was still going when you arrived." "Yes, well tended. Fresh wood within the hour. Within the hour of 8 in the morning. That's my estimate." Abel's brother looked at the chimney. Cold now. The house empty for 4 weeks. "Someone tended that fire," he said. "Put wood on it. And then they were gone." "Yes. They didn't just walk away and forget about it. They tended the fire. They were present. They were going about their morning." He stopped. "And then they were gone." "Yes," Nathan said. Abel's brother looked at the yard, at the fence line, at the road beyond it. "Where did they go?" he said. This was not really a question. It was the thing you said when there was nothing else to say, the place the conversation arrived when it had exhausted all the productive directions and had only the one remaining and could not go there because there was nothing there. Nathan did not answer it. What he did not say, because it was not provable, and because it was the kind of thing that sat better left unspoken, was what the evidence had been telling him since the first morning, that they had not left. That the absence of any track past the farm's boundaries was not a failure of the search. He had not missed the tracks. They were not there. The family had been on this farm in the middle of their mourning, and whatever happened next had not involved them going anywhere. They had not left. They were simply gone. He had been holding these 2 facts side by side since October 15th, and had found that they could not be made to coexist in any account he could construct. Because they did not leave, and they are gone, were logically incompatible, and yet both were supported by the evidence, and he could not abandon either one. He wrote them in his notebook, side by side, and let them sit unresolved, the way the hollow let most things sit, carefully held, without forcing a conclusion that the evidence did not support. He had been letting things sit like this, in this notebook, for 20 years. Most of them eventually resolved into something. The strange became explicable with time, or the explanation arrived from an unexpected direction, or the record simply closed with an honest acknowledgement that the account was incomplete. He had written no explanation found before, and accepted it. He wrote it again here. He found it harder to accept this time. The Holt farm was sold to a family from the East Valley in 1886. 2 years after the disappearance, after Abel's brother had decided he could not farm it himself, and that leaving it empty was not a viable long-term arrangement. The new family came in the spring and worked the farm with the specific industriousness of people who had paid for something and intended to make it work. They knew about the Holts. The Hollow had told them, as the Hollow told people who came to live in it, the things they needed to know. They had decided it was a thing that had happened, and that the farm was a farm, and that the two facts could coexist without one negating the other. Nathan visited the new family in their first winter on the property. He told himself he was going to welcome them to the Hollow, which was true. He did not tell himself the other reason, which was that he needed to stand in that kitchen again. He had been thinking about that kitchen since October, and he needed to see it occupied. He came on a late November morning, cold and clear. The new family had him in and gave him coffee at the table. The same kitchen, a fire going in the hearth. He sat and answered their questions about the Hollow and helped them understand some of what they had inherited in terms of the land's specific character and the people they would need to know. He was good at this. He had done it before for other new arrivals. He looked at the hearth while he talked. The fire was going well. Someone had tended it recently. Fresh wood, good burn, the specific character of a fire that was being maintained by people who were present and attentive. The room was warm. The table had their things on it. He thought about Abel and Miriam and Clara and Jonas in this room on the morning they disappeared. Doing what this new family was doing, sitting at this table, drinking coffee by this fire, the ordinary occupation of a household at the beginning of a cold morning. He thought about the bread cut and left on the board, the coffee made and left to cool, the fire tended and then untended, burning through the rest of that October day on its last feeding, holding the heat of that last morning for 6 hours before it finally gave it up. The farm had continued after the Holts, the way physical things continued, without acknowledgement, without pause. The table had been there, the hearth had been there, the fire had burned until it had nothing left to burn. He thanked the new family and went home. He wrote in his notebook that evening, visited the Holt farm. New family is settled and well. The kitchen is occupied the way it should be. The fire was going when I arrived. He paused. He wrote, someone had tended it recently. The room was warm. He set down his pen and looked at what he had written. He thought, it is only a fire. He thought, I know that. He did not write anything else that evening. The fire had burned all night. By morning, everyone was gone, not fled, not taken, not explained by any account that Nathan Alderman could construct from the evidence, which was complete and careful, and produced nothing that told him what had happened, only what had not. They had not been harmed. No sign of it anywhere in the house or the yard. No struggle, no forced entry, no mark of violence on any surface. They had not departed. No track left the property. Nathan had read that ground with 30 years of practice and 2 reliable witnesses, and they had found nothing. The soft October earth would have held a footprint clearly. There was nothing to hold. They had been here, doing what they did on an ordinary October morning, tending their fire, cutting their bread, drawing their water, and then they had not been here. The morning had continued without them in the way mornings continued, the coffee cooling, the fire burning lower, the water in the bucket slowly taking the cold of the afternoon air. The fire burned until mid-afternoon. The coffee cooled, the bread dried on the board. The water bucket stood full beside the well until Abel's neighbor came that evening and found it and carried it inside. The farm carried on because farms carried on. because the physical world did not pause for absences, did not acknowledge them, simply continued in the condition it had been left in until something changed that condition. The animals needed feeding, the fire needed tending. These things happened because they had to, because someone arranged for them to happen, and the someone was not the Holts. The Holts were gone. In the Hollow's reckoning, in Nathan Alderman's careful notebook, in the accounts that passed from person to person across the years that followed, the Holt family of October 1884 was a question that had no answer, not an unsolved mystery exactly, because mystery implied that the answer existed somewhere and had not yet been found. This was something else. This was an event without an account, something that had happened clearly and specifically and with witnesses to its aftermath, that the available framework of what could happen did not contain. 4 people had tended their fire and begun their mourning and stopped. "I do not have a word for what happened here," Nathan had written. He kept looking for one in the years that followed. He never found it. "I have the fire, I have the bread, I have the tracks that go nowhere. I have 4 people who are here, and then were not. That is all I have. These are the stories from the edges of the recorded world,